So I decided what I was going to do is use some C++ libraries in Swift. I'm going to be using two main libraries in this case. There's a C++ library called Cairo, which is for basic graphics manipulation, and then another library, librrsvg, which is used for reading SVG files. Specifically, in this case, we're using it to read SVG files that will be used in Cairo. And the libraries can be installed via brew. So I looked at the options of how to do C++ in Swift. And there is no way to just directly do C++ in Swift. There is a way to do Swift to C to C++, but I didn't want to do C because I definitely know Objective-C more than I know C. So I decided to go ahead and go with Objective-C as my intermediary, essentially, between the Swift and the C++ code. The thing to know is if you're going to use a C++ library, you need to make sure that your Objective-C framework has access to the headers and library files. And you must make sure that you copy and link those libraries when you compile. So I go ahead, I compile the app. It runs on my machine because I've linked everything. And then if I go to somebody else's machine, I get this. Dynamic library not loaded, so-and-so with this path. I'm thinking to myself, but I know I installed it on my machine. And I copied them, but why is it not working in the other machine? Well, I find out, like, you have to make sure that your dependencies are linked properly and the dependencies know where to look for those other dependencies. And so this is where you get into the real confusing part about organizing your dependencies and figuring out, okay, how do I tell these things, these dilibs essentially, where to look for other ones. So there's a few ways of doing this. You can go, there's a command called otool, and you give it a path to a dilib, and it'll give you a list of all the dependencies that that file uses. I also used a brew deps tree, which then tells me, okay, like for instance with Cairo, I can run brew deps tree, and it'll tell me every brew dependency that Cairo has. Excuse me. And then to make sure that I'm updating my dependencies correctly, I can then use install name tool to then update those dependency paths. Sorry. Yeah. That's fine. So I ended up having to write a script to do this. And so we have here a way to go through, look through each dependencies, and make sure I use install name tool to update those paths. In this case, you'll see that $1. I'm calling this as a run script, so I'm passing in the path to the executable or the framework that I'm using, the Objective-C framework that I'm building. So going through this, we first use otool to find out what dependencies we're looking for. And I make sure that I only get dependencies that aren't system ones. So I don't want anything that's system installed. I only want stuff that's like in the opt folder or used by a brew package. And then I go through and run install name tool to change the identification name and the path to look in. And I do that again, basically on every framework that or dependency I've installed. So in other words, kind of a recurring thing. And then do it again, change the identification name and the path to look in. And then I look for every library there and make sure I've updated the identification names there as well in the paths. So once that worked, I was good to go. I actually was able to run it on another machine and it worked great. So the next thing is making sure Swift and Objective-C work well together. So Objective-C is kind of the framework that the Objective-C framework directly interfaces with Cairo and librrsvg, the API and the pointers. And then the Swift framework is kind of the entry point for the application. That's where I parse the JSON. That's where I go and tell the Objective-C app, here I need you to make this resize, and so and so. Kind of here's the basic ideas. You have your main, and then Swift goes ahead, it parses the JSON file we talked about with the set and the destination path and the sizes. It creates the final handle, it passes the specifications we're looking for, and then it tracks each export using Grand Central Dispatch. And then the Objective-C is the one that actually calls into Cairo and libarsvg. It creates a surface to draw on, it makes the modifications, the resizing, it finalizes and writes the file. And then it will return an error, and then we take that error and we make it friendly for Swift to do whatever it needs to do, whatever feedback it needs to give to the user. So some things to know. Objective-C doesn't support structs or enums or tuples. Everything pretty much has to be a class, its subclasses, and its object. And enums, the Swift enums don't work in Objective-C. So what I ended up doing in a lot of cases, I'd create an enum in Swift and then have and also the enum in Objective-C separately and make sure that those two can convert either way. One thing you're going to want to do with your Objective-C code is to adopt the try-catch pattern with any method that could return an error. And the way to do that is either have a return, if you have a return type, you want it to be nullable in Objective-C, and we'll talk about nullable in a little bit, or if there is no return type, have it return a Boolean. And make sure that the last parameter that you use is a parameter named error with an NS error pointer. And then what will automatically happen is that in Swift, when I call that method, it will call that method as if it's a throwable method. That's how it's interpreted. You also want to make sure that your Objective-C code annotates whether something is nullable or not nullable, and we have that now. So for every property, function, or parameter or return value, you can specify whether it's nullable or not nullable using that annotation. You can also preface certain sections of your code using NS-assume non-null begin and NS-assume non-null end, and that will define everything that's inside there as not nullable. And so once you do that, you avoid having to worry about implicit unwrapped optionals being used within Swift. And it'll actually be either question mark optional or not. The other thing I did was I set up continuous integration using Travis CI.